In a world where time had lost meaning, where food advice was plentiful and metabolisms were stalling, one man had the courage to stand up against the tyranny of medical science. He had vowed to eat some vegetables. He had considered not eating too many processed foods. He had weighed the merits of multivitamins and supplements, and had more or less maintained his at-home fitness regime. One man, one bag of chips, 370 calories, about 45 chips, 21 grams of fat, and 430 milligrams of sodium, 15% of his recommended daily carbohydrate intake, and 920 milligrams of potassium. This spring, Benjamin Siegel is eating a bag of chips by himself.
Hey everyone, Benjamin Siegel here, and welcome back to Taste, Culture, and Power. You can probably picture an American nutritional label, that square item on the back of most commercial food products that tells you exactly what's in it. Ingredients, protein, calories, fat, carbohydrates, maybe some vitamins and minerals at the bottom. It's a pretty standard documentation, and there are versions of it in every country around the world. We're going to come back to the origins of the nutrition label in just a little bit, but before we do that, I want us to think a little bit about the meaning of science itself, and of one particular mode of science, measurement. Measurements, if you've ever studied the history of science or a theory of science, they're never just measurements. They're never objective facts in the world, but rather they're statements about values, statements about beliefs, and barometers through which we express certain implicit views of the world. Now, nutrition, of course, is seen as a science, and in some sense, like all sciences, it's also a way of seeing, perceiving, and organizing the world. It contains within it the idea of measurement and many specific measurements within it. This is all a little bit abstract and kind of trippy, so we're going to start out today in a more concrete sense. We're going to look at the invention of one standard unit of measurement that you all have a relationship with. And that, of course, is the calorie. We're going to see how the calorie isn't just some neutral scientific value, but rather how it was used in the 20th century to quantify and thereby change the relationship between people, labor, land, and food. There's a lot more than just the number of calories in a bag of potato chips. We're then going to look at the emerging science of nutrition, and I'm going to offer a periodization of different paradigms of nutrition that have characterized that field over the last 100 years or so, presaging some of the conversations that we're soon going to have about modern foodways and modern food politics. So let's begin by talking about one of the most important experiments in the history of modern science, which the historian Nick Calather helped to recover about a decade or so back in his article called The Foreign Policy of the Calorie, which appeared in the American Historical Review. In March 1896, at Wesleyan University in Connecticut, William Atwater sealed a graduate student into an airtight chamber. Now, if you're a graduate student watching this, you're probably going to be pretty happy to know that those sorts of experiments aren't really allowed anymore. But the goal of that experiment was really simple and straightforward. He wanted to discover just how much food the human race needed to survive. This was a kind of old-fashioned experiment, but it seemed very modern at the time, and it appeared in many news reports. All of those accounts likened his experiment to a meat locker. It described a room that was about as large as an ordinary prison cell. Inside that graduate student, A.W. Smith, took measured quantities of bread, baked beans, hamburgers, milk, and mashed potatoes through an airlock in the cell at different periods. When he wasn't eating, he was asked to lift weights and to study German books on physics to force his brain to exert itself. Meanwhile, there were thermometers, hydrometers, and electrically powered condensers, pumps, and fans that were measuring the movement of heat, air, and matter in and out of the chamber. There was a word that they came up with for this particular cell or box, and that was a calorimeter, a device that had previously been used to measure the combustive energy of explosives or engines. It recorded all of his food intake and labor outputs in units of thermal energy, or calories. The calorie wasn't new. It was about 75 years old at the time of this experiment. But its definer, Nicolas Clement, had used it as a standard unit of heat in 1824, taking it from the Latin word for heat, calor. But the experiment was a big success. It was the first time that it had been used to measure human energy input and output. And the scientist was soon able to move on to other experiments. He got a champion cyclist, Nat Butler, and put him inside the calorimeter to establish how far a man ought to ride a bicycle on one egg. The captain of Wesleyan's football team volunteered to take a French final inside the calorimeter to determine the amount of heat generated by an hour of thinking. The experiment got a ton of public attention. His pronouncement that mathematical laws governed the act of eating was sensational to reporters in the United States and around the world. Priests and other clergymen applauded the idea that the body created in the image of God produced energy more efficiently than a train did. And when Dr. Atwood confirmed that liquor was, in fact, nutritious, at least by the terms of energy generation, the Women's Christian Temperance Union organized a campaign against the professor. This was big news at the time. But really, there was one group particularly interested in Atwater's work, and that, of course, was the government. The American Secretary of State went to Boston for the purpose of seeing a model of the calorimeter, which he judged an invaluable invention. The United States Department of Agriculture soon built a copy of this same experiment in Washington, D.C., and before long there was a major congressional approval and funds to continue this work at a government level. So why, of course, would the government be so interested? Before the calorie, the notion that the food supply of the world could be managed at a global or a national level was absurd. It was inconceivable. Thomas Malthus, who would come up with the term of food supply, regarded food supplies as fixed. It was a check on the growing population and wealth of every country. The question of food supply, how much food there was in a country or in the world, had been deeply confusing in the 19th century. There had been lots of efforts at national projects of agricultural improvement in the 19th century, but they generally focused on the health of one particular crop. There was the discovery of plant nutrition by the scientist Justus von Liebig, the idea that you could grow more food on every acre, but the total national capacities of food seemed to remain just theoretical. But over the 19th century, there had been more and more standardization with the increase of national markets. Things like the telegraph and the railway, newspapers, all helped to unify national markets, though it took a long time for things like standard weights or grades to be worked out. All of this was kind of confusing in the 19th century. How much food was there that was available to a given country, to a military, or to the world? The calorie was a way to solve that problem. It conceptually rolled all commodities, all farms, all markets into one unit of measurement. So it allowed people to compare ideas of aggregate food availability from place to place, from institution to institution, and eventually from person to person. It also opened up new ideas about what the human being itself should do. There was a possibility of understanding how human beings had appetites, why they would be full from some dishes but not other dishes. And there was this idea that food production and consumption could be balanced at the individual level, at the family level, at the national level, or the international level. It was a tool that allowed Americans and then eventually folks all over the world to put food into comparative conversation from one place to another. You could use it in very practical ways too. A scientific measurement for determining the amount of food available could help regulate factories or prisons or schools or armies. It could help planning offices come up with proper standardized rations. It could test hypotheses about the different energy requirements of different types of work or different places where work was to be done. Basically, the calorie was a tool that was going to allow scientists to make exact comparisons between the diets of different places. And that was the magic simplicity of this new idea of the calorie. This idea of the calorie then bled into a new field of study, which we now would know as nutrition. And that new paradigm of nutrition became increasingly important throughout the whole world. It was particularly important in the British Empire, the largest of the global empires, because there was a need to measure, govern, and regulate the diets of all the different colonized peoples of the world. Official investigations into health in different colonies showed that improved diets might improve labor efficiency or the buying power of given rural populations. Quickly, British officials took the calorimeter and the idea of nutrition and the calorie to their colonies. In 1927, Robert Boyd Orr, who would later become the chairman of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United States, suggested that the meat and milk blood diet of Kenya's Maasai warriors produced more energy and a stronger physique than the vegetarian diet of the Kikuyu people in Kenya. It was a way of comparing populations in imperial context, too. Those same experiments were being done in India by Robert McCarrison in the Kannur nutritional laboratories there. Imperial officials now recognized that tolerable rates of disease and mortality in an earlier era really had been a drag on imperial productivity. Raising living standards through increased food production could generate a demand for economic activity too. So nutrition was a tool that was used in imperial context to link problems of public health and agricultural productivity and tie it too to important languages of race and ethnicity in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s too. International organizations were of course really interested in this work. The founding document of what would eventually become the FAO was the 1936 report of the League Commission on Nutrition. And that really was a compilation of nutritional requirements, diet surveys, and policy comparisons from one country to another. Nutrition helped to allow this kind of comparison between food standards in different countries. So it should be pretty clear to us by now that this discovery of nutrition as an objective science wasn't really that. Instead, it was really the story of how politics helped govern the idea of comparison in food between one place and another, too. We use nutrition in many different meaningful ways. Nutrition is a way that we govern our own lives. There are fields of study, different debates, scientific journals in nutrition. Nutrition is a science like anything else. At the same time, it also bears with it this kind of comparative political identity as well, too. But nutrition as a science and the meaning of nutrition has really changed over the last 100 years or so. It used to be that the major focus of nutrition research and practice was concern over which foods would be required to avoid nutritional deficiencies or illness. And now, more often in the context that we work in, the question is what kinds of foods or supplements we might consume to promote optimal health. Functional foods are this kind of vocabulary that we're going to come back to in just a second, but we certainly know things like energy bars or supplements or herbal remedies, and all of these rely upon a changing paradigm of nutrition too. So I'm going to offer us, with the time that we have left, 5 major stages in how nutrition as a science itself can be seen. And as we consider these paradigms, let's think about how nutrition might have been used as a seemingly objective ideology in each one of these different moments. The first notion really governing the idea of nutrition was that of food being equivalent to energy. And that's something that we can date to the 1880s or so to around 1920, or the post-First World War settlement. By the end of the 19th century, scientists had really identified the different energy-yielding components of food. We know them today: protein, fats, and carbohydrates. Those had all been identified, and nutritional research on the metabolism of proteins and the energy composition of foods was really flourishing in laboratories around the world. Much of this work had been done first on animals, so the human nutrition experiments that Dr. Atwater did was particularly new and innovative, moving from other animals to human animals. We got, in this moment, the different energy yields of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And those are values that are still used today. You can look on the back of a nutrition label and see the different values. So this was the first phase of nutritional research, the identification of food as energy, and then the idea that it was mostly energy disparities that needed to be corrected from a policy standpoint. In the 1920s to the 1940s, there was a paradigm shift in the understanding of the etiology of different diseases, and it focused on the question of micronutrients and their deficiency. Until this time, it was generally thought that disease resulted from poor sanitation and hygiene. So it was usually bacteria or molds or toxins that were identified as the likely causes of most diseases. So in order to combat those diseases and to increase shelf life, industrial food was sterilized, milled, and polished to reduce the danger of ingesting bacteria, mold, and toxins. This is ground that we've covered before. But in spite of those efforts, diseases like pellagra or beriberi or infantile scurvy increased. So it was soon realized that, and in a number of studies that were conducted by Joseph Goldberger between around 1914 to 1920, the diets of individuals suffering from pellagra were compared to those of healthy individuals who didn't have pellagra. And Dr. Goldwater was able to identify different foods that decrease the presence of diarrhea and dementia in pellagra patients. Dr. Goldberger was able to determine that pellagra owed to a diet that was poor in the vitamin niacin and not from infection. And experiments like these between the 1920s and the 1940s helped to bring the rise of a second guiding paradigm in nutrition. The idea that there were micronutrients like vitamins or minerals that needed to be managed in human diets alongside the broader macronutrient category. One of the most important periods in the history of public health nutrition came right after the First World War, when it became possible for the first time to manufacture micronutrients that had been identified by chemists as essential for human health. In 1922, for the first time, the United States government suggested a policy that salt manufacturers add iodine to their product. This was the first public health effort to eradicate a nutrient deficiency in the United States, preventing things like goiter. This fortification of foods soon became a standard policy in industrial foods in the United States, Western Europe, and later around the world. And it was a tool that policymakers used to address rampant public health problems, things like rickets that were prevented by vitamin D, or beriberi prevented by thiamine, pellagra prevented by niacin, or dental cavities prevented by fluoride, all of which made their way into the foods and water that we consumed. Eventually, these kind of nutritional requirements around the question of micronutrients played out in different experiments that took place during the Second World War. And in the early 1940s, the Food and Nutrition Board of the National Academy of Sciences reviewed the scientific evidence available to them and developed the recommended dietary allowances for energy, protein, and 8 different essential vitamins and minerals. Again, those are on the back of nutritional labels that you see today. In 1946, the first national food supplementation program was initiated, the National School Lunch Act, and it was aimed at improving the dietary intake of children from economically disadvantaged families. So by this period, by the end of the Second World War, nutrition had become an issue of public policy in the United States and Europe, and there were efforts at supplementing in public diets that really were aimed at addressing this. In the last 40 years of the 20th century, there were new discoveries in the fields of nutritional biochemistry, and there was a new research emphasis on the role of nutrition in the cause of or the treatment of chronic disease. It became clear by the 1960s that disease patterns had shifted in Western Europe and the United States. They had moved from diseases of deficiency increasingly to diseases that came from excess, things like cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancer, osteoporosis. These were diseases that came from having too much as opposed to having too little. When there were nutritional deficiencies, they tended to be secondary to restrictive dietary habits or economic deprivation or the presence of another disease that altered metabolism. So these diseases became less important over the course of the 20th century. We can sort of intuit why these diseases picked off. There were modern household technologies that increased productivity in housework but decreased physical activity. The home-cooked family meal became rarer and rarer. Varied diets that had a variety of whole grains, vegetables, and fruits gave way to convenient foods. There was a rise in the overall consumption of fats and sugar. In 1948, for the first time, there was a major study conducted on the relationship between fat intake and cardiovascular disease, the Framingham Heart Study. And there was a realization, even though we've kind of corrected for it now, that each type of fat played a particular role in health and disease. So by the late 20th century, nutrition was seen in Western Europe and the United States and a few other places as a study of chronic disease, borne out not by deficiencies but by excess. After the 1990s, the American and Western European public had another shift in paradigms of nutrition. Increasingly, people in these places began to wonder if the essential minerals, vitamins, and macronutrients that were seen as the staple of nutrition in an earlier period were actually enough to maintain optimal health. They questioned the meaning of an essential nutrient and wondered if certain things had been left out. So as a result of this different line of questioning, herbal and botanical extracts, phytochemicals, and alternative forms of nutrition were called upon to promote optimal health. And we know this today if we scroll through an Instagram account, for instance, and see all of the different reishi mushrooms or superfoods or goji berries that are touted towards us as being important towards our individual nutrition. By the turn of the 21st century, the United States market for functional food was in the many billions of dollars, and it continues to grow by about 12 to 20% each year. All you have to do, again, is really scroll through an Instagram feed or a Facebook ad to really see evidence of this too. It's also led to the rise of chains like GNC, for instance, which were really fringe in the 1970s and 1980s, but have become really central today, or their online direct-to-consumer equivalents. So let's offer some broad themes here. The narrative of nutrition in the 20th century and 21st century is in some ways straightforward. There's a rise of a new technology that allows for standardization, for an optic of comparing nutritional requirements and availability between country and country. But at the same time, we can see how that story of nutrition changed over the last 120 years or so. And we can see the different ways in which nutrition advanced different ideas about how humans should eat and consume and what public policy or individual action should do to rectify deficiencies. Nutrition, as we've seen, emerged out of a particular configuration of interests and needs at a moment that was craving scientific explanation for changing human outcomes. But it long outlived that initial moment, and it's had a very interesting afterlife in the 20th and 21st century. We can use different nutritional idioms in different ways, and of course nutrition is important to all of us as we think about the foods that we eat. But we should keep in mind that nutrition isn't a neutral scientific idiom, but rather it's still a way of comparing populations or individuals who may have very different aims. We're going to talk more about the implication of different ideas of nutrition very soon, so stay tuned. Again, thanks for watching. See you next time.